Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting golden light across the wooden beams of the quiet inn. A gentle breeze stirred the lanterns outside, filling the night air with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. The evening was peaceful, but beneath the hush of twilight, something lingered, an old tale waiting to be told. A whisper of the past, carried by the wind, beyond the settled lands, past rolling hills and ancient forests. The ruins of a forgotten kingdom lay shrouded in mist. Arnor, once a land of kings and warriors, had been swallowed by time's heavy hand. Its great halls now silent, its name little more than an echo in the songs of bards. But some legacies refuse to fade, and some whispers demand to be heard. The rain had come in the night, a soft and steady rhythm washing over the northern wilds. As the morning sun fought its way through lingering silver mist, a lone traveler made his way along an overgrown path. His boots sank slightly into the softened earth, his dark cloak heavy with the dampness of travel. He was Kadrin, a wandering scholar of Gondorian descent, though his heart had long belonged to the mysteries of the north. The sigil embroidered on his cloak, a book encircled by a silver star, marked him as one who sought knowledge of the old world before time and war could erase it. His journey had led him deep into the lands once ruled by Arnor. Unlike Gondor, whose white walls still stood unyielding against the ages, Arnor had crumbled, its proud cities overgrown, its ruins lost to ivy and silence. But history, Kadrin knew, was not so easily buried. Legends spoke of a vault hidden beneath the ruins of Fornost, where the last kings of Arnor had locked away relics of power before their fall. Some called it a myth, the ramblings of dreamers and madmen, but Kadrin had spent years tracing the echoes of history, gathering fragments of old manuscripts, searching for the place where truth and legend met. And now, at last, he had found a clue, a passage in a decaying text that hinted at a secret chamber beneath the city's bones. But he would not seek it alone. At the crossroads near the old stone bridge of Tharbad, he waited for his companion, a ranger of the north, one of the last of the Dunedain. These were the scattered remnants of the great line of men who had once ruled Arnor, now exiles and wanderers, guardians of a kingdom long fallen to ruin. The midday sun broke through the mist as the ranger arrived, his presence ghost-like, emerging from the undergrowth with the silence of a hunting wolf. Clad in the dark greens and browns of his kin, his weathered cloak bore the silver star of the Dunedain. At his hip rested a longsword, a bow slung over his shoulder. His name was Eldon, a man of quiet strength, whose ancestors had once walked the halls of Anuminas before the kingdom had shattered into dust. Kadrin unfolded the aged parchment in his hands. I found something. A lead, perhaps more than that. It speaks of a hidden chamber beneath Fornost. If we find it, we may learn what truly became of Arnor in its final days. Eldon studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Then we should not delay. Night fall soon, and the ruins are not as empty as they seem. They turned toward the road ahead, toward the ruins where history waited beneath the stone. The sun dipped lower in the sky as they traveled northward, the golden light casting long shadows through the tangled canopy. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the distant murmur of a river humming beneath the rhythm of their footsteps. The road to Fornost had long since faded into wilderness, reclaimed by time. What had once been a city of kings was now a graveyard of broken towers and shattered walls, whispering secrets to the wind. Cadrin walked slightly ahead, eyes fixed on the worn map he had painstakingly reconstructed from scattered texts and forgotten records. The vault should be beneath the eastern keep, he murmured. If the manuscript is correct, there should be an entrance buried somewhere beneath the foundations. Eldon's sharp gaze scanned the tree line. If we find the entrance, he corrected. And if we do, we must be ready for what lies within. You think something lingers there. Eldon's expression was unreadable. Ruins remember things, and not all memories are kind. They pressed onward, the weight of history settling around them as they crossed an ancient stone bridge, its surface slick with moss. A strange sensation crawled along Cadrin's spine. He paused, turning slightly. Something was watching them. Eldon sensed it too. His hand found the hilt of his sword as he glanced toward the thickening woods beyond the path. "We are not alone," he murmured. A low rumbling echoed through the trees, followed by the faintest whisper of movement, too slow for the wind, too measured for a wild animal. Cadrin swallowed hard. Could it be something from Fornost? Eldon shook his head. Wolves do not guard dead cities. Without another word, he motioned for Cadrin to move. They pressed forward with newfound urgency, taking the lesser-worn paths, their steps silent against the forest floor. But the feeling of unseen eyes did not fade. Only when they reached the outer ruins of Fornost did the sensation lift, as if whatever had stalked them had chosen not to cross into the city's boundaries. Eldon exhaled. "Something lingers in these lands," he said grimly, "and it does not wish to be seen." Cadrin shuddered. The ruins stretched before them, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. What had once been the grand capital of Arnor was now a city of ghosts, silent, crumbling, lost to time. They passed beneath the shattered archway of the eastern keep, the path leading downward into the heart of the ruins. Statues of long-dead kings stood watch over the broken streets, their faces worn smooth by wind and rain. "The vault lies beneath," Cadrin whispered. "We must find the old stairwells. If the records are true, they will lead us to the catacombs." They picked their way through the ruins, careful to avoid the treacherous gaps where the ground had caved in. Vines curled around the remnants of old stone buildings, and faded banners of silver and blue still clung to the walls. Then, at last, they found it, a set of ancient stairs, half buried beneath fallen rubble. "This is it," Cadrin breathed. Eldon gave him a steady look. "Then we descend." The air grew colder as they moved downward, torches flickering against rough stone walls. Ancient carvings adorned the passageway, depicting the last kings of Arnor, a legacy now lost to dust. Then, at the end of the corridor, they saw it, a great iron door, sealed with runes of old. Cadrin stepped forward, fingers tracing the inscriptions. This is the vault. But something was wrong. Eldon stiffened, his gaze dark. "Look at the dust," he said quietly. Cadrin's breath caught. The dust had been disturbed. Someone has been here before us. A chill ran through the air, as if the vault itself exhaled a breath of warning. The door loomed before them, waiting, and somewhere in the darkness, something stirred. The silence in the vault was thick, as if the very air held its breath. The great iron door before them loomed like a sentinel of the past, its surface layered with dust and the faint glow of ancient runes. Cadrin stepped closer, his fingers tracing the worn inscriptions, their meanings obscured by time. The chamber beyond had remained untouched by sunlight for centuries, until now. Eldon knelt and ran his fingers through the dust along the floor. His sharp gaze darkened. "This is fresh," he murmured. "Whoever disturbed this vault did so recently." Cadrin swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. "But the city has been abandoned for centuries." A sudden gust of cold air rushed through the passage, causing the torches to flicker wildly. Shadows against the stone walls twisted unnaturally, stretching as if something unseen moved within them. It was not merely the weight of the past pressing upon them. It was something else. The vault had been opened, and something had come through. Cadrin reached into his satchel, retrieving an old silver key. Its intricate engravings matched the runes on the iron door, a relic passed down through his family for generations. A fragment of history, a piece of a forgotten past now guiding him toward the truth. He exhaled, steadying himself, and inserted the key into the lock. The moment it turned, an eerie click echoed through the chamber. The runes flared to life, cold blue light pulsing across the surface of the door. Stone ground against stone, dust cascading from the seams as the door slowly, ponderously, began to shift. The sound was ancient, a groaning whisper of time itself yielding. Then the door swung open. Beyond lay a vast chamber, untouched by the outside world. A golden glow illuminated the space, casting light upon massive stone pillars adorned with intricate carvings. The walls, lined with forgotten inscriptions, whispered the names of kings long gone. At the far end of the chamber, resting upon a pedestal of blackened stone, was the true treasure of Arnor, the crown of the north. It sat untouched, its silver gleaming under the torchlight, adorned with sapphires that shimmered like frozen stars. Cadrin's breath caught. It still exists, but Eldon did not move toward the crown. His gaze was fixed on the walls, on the faint markings that marred the stone. Deep gouges, like clawed fingers raking through time itself. His voice was low, unreadable. "We are not the first to come here." Cadrin turned, following his gaze, and saw what he meant. The disturbed dust, the unnatural way the air shimmered in certain places, as if the vault itself was holding its breath. Something had been here. Something was still here. The torches flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the vault. And then, from somewhere deep within the chamber, came the sound of breathing. Slow, deep, not the wind, not the echo of their own presence. Something else. Eldon's grip tightened on his sword as he motioned for Cadrin to step back. But it was was too late. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the vault. From behind the farthest sarcophagus, something shifted. A figure, half seen in the flickering light, tall, cloaked in shadows. Then it spoke. "I have waited long for one such as you." The voice was ancient, hollow. It carried the weight of ages past, of sorrow and forgotten oaths. From the darkness, a spectral figure emerged, its form wreathed in an unnatural mist, neither fully present nor entirely absent. A shade of Arnor. Once, it had been a guardian, a knight sworn to protect the kingdom, even beyond death. But time had twisted it, left it lingering, bound to this place by an unfinished duty. Its glowing eyes fixated on Cadrin. "You carry the blood of the North," it whispered. "You come seeking a kingdom long buried." Cadrin's voice trembled, but he did not falter. "I do not seek to disturb your rest. I seek only to restore what was lost." The shade's expression was unreadable, but the air around them grew colder. "The past cannot be restored without cost." Eldon's voice was steady, blade in hand. "What price do you ask?" The shade stepped forward, shadows coiling around it like smoke. "One does not claim the crown without proving their worth. Will you face the trial?" The vault trembled. The runes along the walls pulsed with a warning, ancient energy stirring the air. Something deep in the earth shifted. The trial was about to begin. The moment the shades spoke the words, the chamber around them changed. The air thickened. Shadows elongated. The torches dimmed, their light retreating as if devoured by the dark. Then the sarcophagi of the old kings began to tremble. Dust crumbled from the stone. Figures rose from their tombs. Spectral remnants of Arnor's rulers, shades of the past, bound to their duty even in death. The first of them stepped forward, clad in the armor of a king long lost to history. His voice echoed across the chamber. "The kingdom fell because of weakness. Show us you are strong." Another, his form barely holding shape, whispered, "The kingdom fell because of distrust. Prove that you are loyal." A third, his presence radiating sorrow, simply asked, "What will you sacrifice to restore what has been lost?" The chamber fell silent. The weight of ages pressed down upon them. Cadrin swallowed, forcing himself to meet their hollow gazes. He understood now. This was not a trial of swords, but of something far greater. He turned to Eldon, his voice low. "We cannot fight them." Eldon nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The trial was not about battle. It was about understanding the past. Cadrin stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart. "I do not claim to be a king," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I am only a man seeking to honor the past, to unite what has been divided. I cannot change history, but I can ensure its memory is carried forward." The ghostly kings regarded him in silence. The shade, watching closely, tilted its head. "And what will you sacrifice?" Cadrin did not hesitate. "My name, my legacy. If that is what it takes to restore Arnor, then let history remember not me, but those who came before." A long silence. Then, one by one, the shades of the kings lowered their weapons. Their presence began to fade, dissolving into mist. Their duty at last fulfilled. The crown of Arnor, untouched for centuries, began to glow with renewed light. Cadrin stepped forward. This time, when he reached for it, the vault did not resist him. He had passed the trial. The crown of Arnor rested in Cadrin's hands, its silver surface gleaming under the torchlight. It felt heavy not only in weight, but in history, in the burden of a kingdom long lost to time. The sapphires embedded in its band shimmered like frozen stars, reflecting the faint glow of the runes still pulsing along the chamber walls. The trial had been passed. The ghosts of Arnor's past had given their judgment. And yet, as Cadrin held the crown, he felt something stir beneath his fingertips. The vault was not yet finished with them. Eldon exhaled slowly beside him. "We did it," he murmured, but there was hesitation in his voice. His sharp eyes scanned the chamber, lingering on the walls where ancient carvings had begun to shift. But something has changed. Cadrin felt it too. A low hum vibrated through the stone beneath their feet, like a heartbeat buried deep within the ruins. The runes, which had once flickered with cold blue light, now flared brighter, their inscriptions glowing like fire against the darkened walls. Then, from the depths of the chamber, the stone groaned. The ground beneath them trembled. And suddenly, a section of the floor at the far end of the room collapsed inward. Dust and debris scattered into the air, revealing something long hidden a passageway, carved into the very foundations of the vault. Eldon instinctively reached for his sword. "What is that?" Cadrin stepped forward cautiously, peering down into the newly revealed corridor. Unlike the vault, which had been sealed for centuries, this passage looked as though it had been waiting. The walls bore engravings far older than any he had seen before, lines of elvish script woven into the stone like whispers of a forgotten past. This is something else," Cadrin said breathlessly. "Not just a vault, a sanctuary." Eldon's brow furrowed. A sanctuary. Cadrin traced the markings along the nearest pillar, recognizing the elegant script of the Eldar. "The elves," he murmured. "The elves of the north. They were here." A sudden whisper curled through the air, drifting through the chamber like a breath of wind. But it was no ordinary wind. It carried words, voices from an age long past. "Seek the lost wisdom, and the path shall be clear." Eldon stiffened, his hand tightening on his blade. "Did you hear that?" Cadrin nodded, his heart pounding. The whisper had not come from the shadows. It had come from the stone itself. The sanctuary was not merely a tomb for lost kings. It was something far greater. Taking a steadying breath, he turned to Eldon. "There's something down there," he said. "Something we were meant to find." Eldon hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then we answer the call." Together, they stepped into the unknown. The corridor stretched deep beneath the ruins, the air growing cooler with every step. The glow of the torchlight cast elongated shadows along the walls, illuminating carvings of elves, not warriors, but scholars, seers, and healers. Unlike the imagery of Arnor's kings, these figures stood apart, their presence ethereal, their expressions solemn. Eldon studied them warily. "This isn't just a vault. This is a hidden chamber of the Eldar." Cadrin nodded. "The records never mentioned this. It was never meant to be found." The air grew heavier, thick with an ancient presence. Then, ahead of them, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. At its center stood a great stone dais, bathed in the ethereal glow of blue and silver light. Upon it rested an ancient brazier, its flame long extinguished, but the scent of old magic still lingered in the air. Surrounding the dais were statues of elves, their hands outstretched as if offering something unseen. Cadrin stepped closer, his fingers brushing over the symbols etched into the stone. "These are the guides of Arnor," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. They stood beside the kings, offering wisdom and counsel. But why would they be here, hidden from the world? Eldon's expression was unreadable as he scanned the room. "Because their wisdom was not meant for all," he said. "Only for those who sought it." Another whisper rippled through the air, carrying with it a deeper voice, one neither threatening nor welcoming. "Restore what was lost. Seek the forgotten veil." Cadrin's breath hitched. The forgotten veil. He turned to Eldon, his mind racing. The name was unfamiliar, yet it carried the weight of something profound, something that had been erased from history itself. Eldon's grip on his sword tightened. "It sounds like a place." Before Cadrin could respond, the brazier atop the dais suddenly flared to life. A ghostly blue-white flame erupted from its depths, casting shifting light across the chamber walls. The inscriptions, once faded and unreadable, began to glow, illuminating a massive map carved into the floor. Cadrin's eyes widened. There, nestled between the ruins of Fornost and the Misty Mountains, was a place unmarked by any known record of men or elves. The Forgotten Vale. Eldon exhaled sharply. Could it be a lost elven sanctuary? Cadrin's pulse quickened. Only one way to find out. The sanctuary had given them direction, but it had also raised more questions than answers. With the crown of Arnor secured, they set out toward the Forgotten Vale, a place of myth and secrecy, a place that had eluded even the most ancient of histories. Their journey took them through the ruins of Fornost, past the broken remnants of a city that had once stood as the heart of Arnor's power. Eldon knelt by a shattered archway, brushing away dust from a sigil carved into the stone. "The last defenders of Arnor stood here," he said, "and they died here." Cadrin stood beside him, the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. And yet, something remains, for in the midst of ruin, there was still hope. As they crossed the northern wilds, the road stretched before them like an untold story. The days passed beneath shifting skis, their path winding through valleys of mist and shadowed forests, untouched by men. Each step carried them closer to the veil, to a truth hidden beyond the boundaries of history. And then, at last, they found it. The Forgotten Vale stretched before them, a land caught between time itself. The air was crisp, laced with an otherworldly stillness. Though the sun hung high, an unnatural twilight clung to the valley, a pale silver luminescence flickering between the trees. A path of smooth, ivory stone wound through the overgrown landscape, leading toward the heart of the vale. Ancient ruins stood silent along the way, their elven carvings worn by centuries of wind and solitude. Cadrin placed a hand against one of the pillars. The stone was warm beneath his touch. Then, as if the veil itself had been waiting, something stirred. A whisper curled through the valley, drifting like mist on the wind. "It It did not come from a single source, but from the very air around them. Why do you seek the heart of the forgotten vale? Cadrin inhaled sharply. The voice was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was something else entirely. He stepped forward. We seek the wisdom of the elves of Arnor, he said. We seek what was lost. A silence followed. Then the light in the valley shifted, coalescing into figures, ethereal beings, their forms shimmering like moonlight on water. Not spirits, not illusions, something in between. The ethereal figures stood motionless, their presence neither threatening nor welcoming. They were unlike any ghosts Cadrin had ever read about, neither lingering remnants of the past nor echoes of forgotten souls. They were something more. Their forms shimmered like moonlight upon water, their features obscured by the shifting glow of the valley. Yet their eyes, if they could be called that, burned with knowledge, deep and endless. The tallest of them stepped forward. His robes, woven from silver light, moved as though untouched by time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries, yet it was neither harsh nor cruel. The line of kings has fallen. The world has moved beyond Arnor's shadow. What remains to restore? Cadrin felt his breath catch. The question struck deep, not just in his mind, but in his very soul. He had spent his life chasing the echoes of a kingdom lost to time, but standing before these beings, before those who had seen it fall, he suddenly found himself wondering. What was he truly seeking? A throne, a name, a place in history? Or was it something more? Eldon, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. The world hasn't forgotten Arnor, he said, his voice steady. The Dunedain still walk these lands. The legacy isn't dead, it's waiting. The shimmering figure regarded them for a long moment, then turned its gaze back to Cadrin. If you wish to reclaim what was lost, then the veil must judge you. The silver light surrounding them shifted. Mist coiled at Cadrin's feet, wrapping around his limbs like a living thing. A low hum vibrated through the stones beneath him, a pulse that resonated not just in his chest, but in his very bones. Then suddenly, he was no longer in the valley. The world blurred and reshaped itself. He stood within a vast hall of marble and sapphire, the banners of Arnor billowing in an unseen wind. The scent of old parchment and candle wax filled the air, the warmth of a flickering hearth casting shadows against polished stone walls. And before him sat a throne, abandoned, yet it commanded his presence. And upon it sat a king. Cadrin's breath faltered. He had seen this face before, not in life, but in tapestries, in old carvings that told of a time before ruin. The last king of Arnor, Valandil II, the ruler who had seen his kingdom crumble beneath war and betrayal. The spectral king studied him with unreadable eyes. You seek the past, he said, his voice deep and steady. But the past is gone. What do you seek for the future? Cadrin felt the weight of the question pressing upon him. His mind raced, searching for the right answer, the one that would satisfy the spirit of the last ruler of the North. He could have said glory. He could have said power. But deep within, he knew those were not his desires. He had spent years traveling ruins, reading histories, listening to the songs of his people. And through it all, he had come to one undeniable truth. Arnor's strength was never in its banners, or its throne. It was in its people. It was in their hope, their resilience. It was in the stories passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, in the echoes of voices that refused to be silenced. So he met the king's gaze and said the only thing that felt true: a future where the name of Arnor is not just remembered, but lived. Silence followed. Then the spectral king slowly inclined his head, and the world shattered around Cadrin. He gasped as the valley returned to him. The shimmering figures of the Vale stood unmoved, watching him with knowing eyes. He turned to Eldon, whose expression was unreadable. Then, at last, the silver-clad being before them spoke. "Then you shall have our wisdom." The air shifted, and suddenly the valley was alive with movement. The ruins that had stood in solemn silence for centuries now pulsed with light. The intricate carvings along the stone walls realigned themselves, shifting into patterns of knowledge long thought lost. Cadrin stepped forward, running his fingers over the now glowing inscriptions. His eyes widened as he read. "This is history," he whispered. "The history of Arnor before its fall. Strategies, treaties, writings never recorded in any book of men. The knowledge of the forgotten Vale had returned." Eldon exhaled, his hands resting on his belt as he scanned the valley. "They were waiting," he murmured, "waiting for someone worthy to carry this forward. And now that duty fell to them. The final days in the Vale were spent in study and reverence." Cadrin and Eldon walked the valley, recording all they could, listening to the whispers of the ancient spirits who had once guided kings. They learned of the alliances Arnor had once forged with the northern elves, of the battles that had driven the kingdom into ruin, and of the mistakes that had cost them everything. And when the time came to leave, they did not do so as wanderers. They left as bearers of Arnor's legacy. The crown of Arnor, once thought to be nothing more than a relic, was now a symbol of the future. As they crossed the threshold of the Vale, stepping once more into the lands of men, Cadrin knew with certainty this was not the end. It was merely the beginning. Their journey led them back through the wilds, past the ruins of Fornost, where ghosts still lingered in the silence. Cadrin traced the edges of an ancient scroll, tucked safely into his pack, the last gift of the elves of the Vale. Within its parchment lay the forgotten strategies, histories, and traditions of Arnor, a guide to a kingdom that could one day rise again. But the weight of history was a delicate thing. Arnor could not be rebuilt with swords and banners alone. It had to be rebuilt in the hearts of its people. Eldon seemed to sense Cadrin's thoughts. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "So, what now?" he mused. "Are you going to march into Gondor and claim your place as heir to Arnor?" Cadrin chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No," he said. "That's not how the story is meant to be told. Arnor was not a throne to be reclaimed. It was a people, waiting to remember their strength." The road stretched before them, winding through valleys bathed in twilight. The stars shimmered above them, their light like echoes of the past. Cadrin turned his gaze northward. There were still Dunedain scattered across the land, the last remnants of Arnor's bloodline. They had lived in exile, hidden among the ruins of their ancestors, waiting for a day that may never come. But now he could bring them hope, not with words of war, but with the wisdom of their past. He imagined the old Dunedain leaders gathered around fires, speaking of the past in hushed voices, their tales half forgotten. Now he could bring them the truth, the histories long buried, the teachings long lost, the faith in something greater than mere survival. The road ahead would be long, uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was not the end. It was the awakening of Arnor. The night deepened, wrapping the northern lands in a hush of silver mist. The stars shimmered above, their cold light spilling across the rolling hills and shadowed valleys. Cadrin and Eldon made camp beneath an ancient oak, its twisted limbs reaching toward the sky like the grasping hands of forgotten kings. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and damp earth lingering in the breeze. Eldon rolled out his cloak, settling against the tree's massive roots with a sigh. We have the crown, we have the knowledge. Now what? His tone was even, but there was something else beneath it, a question unspoken. Cadrin sat across from him, turning the ancient scroll over in his hands. Now, we find the ones who still carry Arnor's blood. He unrolled the parchment, his gaze scanning the delicate elven script. The Dunedain are scattered, but they remain. This will give them more than stories. It will give them purpose. Eldon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. For generations, we've survived in the shadows, protecting what little remains of the North. But survival isn't the same as living. You think they'll follow you. Cadrin looked up. Not me, the truth. Eldon exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. The truth, he murmured. A powerful thing, but dangerous. Cadrin nodded. Which is why we must be careful. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. The night stretched on, and at last, the weight of their journey settled into their bones. Cadrin drifted into sleep, with the whispers of the forgotten vale still echoing in his mind. The road to the Dunedain took them northward, past ruined watchtowers and forgotten paths that had once connected the great cities of Arnor. The wilderness was vast, untouched by the hands of men, reclaimed by time itself. Rivers cut through the valleys, their waters dark and swift, and the forests stretched like an unbroken sea of green and gold. Days passed beneath shifting skis. Rain swept over them in sudden bursts, drenching their cloaks before giving way to cold sunlight. They camped beneath the stars, beneath crumbling arches where vines wove through stone, beneath towering cliffs where the wind howled like a lament for lost kings. Then, at last, they found what they were searching for. Nestled deep within the hills of Eriador, hidden from those who did not know the way, lay the last refuge of the Dunedain. A settlement, small but strong, built among the ruins of an ancient keep. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, the scent of burning wood carried on the wind. Eldon led the way, his steps sure, his shoulders squared. This was his home. The sentries saw them first, men cloaked in shadow, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. One of them stepped forward, his voice low, wary. Who comes? Eldon lifted his hood, his gaze steady. One of your own. Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. Eldon, he lowered his guard slightly. You've been gone long. Eldon glanced at Cadrin before answering. I bring news. and something else. The sentry's gaze shifted to Cadrin, taking in the scholar-worn cloak, the satchel slung across his chest, the weight of history in his eyes. "What is it you bring?" Cadrin reached into his pack. Slowly, reverently, he withdrew the crown of Arnor. The sentry's breath caught. The silver gleamed in the fading light, the sapphires catching the last golden rays of the sun. A long silence stretched between them. Then the sentry nodded once. "Come," he said. "The chieftain will want to see this." They were led through the winding paths of the settlement, past homes built from stone and wood, past children playing in the fading light, past men and women who paused to watch their arrival with quiet curiosity. At the heart of the refuge stood an ancient hall, its timbers darkened by age, its walls adorned with faded banners. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth. At its center sat the chieftain of the Dunedain, an older man, his hair silvered by time, his eyes sharp with the wisdom of many winters. He watched them enter, his expression unreadable. Eldon bowed his head. "Lord Aelric." The chieftain studied him, then turned his gaze to Cadrin. "And you are?" Cadrin stepped forward, a seeker of knowledge. He unrolled the scroll he had carried from the veil, placing it upon the table before them. "And a bearer of truth." Aelric's brow furrowed. He unrolled the parchment further, his eyes scanning the elven script, the ancient maps, the accounts of Arnor's final days. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the ink, as if he were touching the past itself. When he finally looked up, there was something new in his gaze, something Cadrin had not seen before. "Hope, you found it," Aelric whispered. Cadrin nodded. "Not just the records, the crown." He stepped forward, lifting the silver circlet from its wrappings. The firelight flickered against its polished surface, casting a reflection of sapphires upon the walls. A hush fell over the room. The weight of history settled upon them all. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Aelric exhaled, slow and steady. "This is more than a relic." He looked at Cadrin. "You understand that?" Cadrin met his gaze. "I do." The chieftain leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And what would you have us do with it?" Cadrin hesitated, then chose his words carefully. "I do not ask for a king to rise. I do not ask for war. But the time for hiding is over." His voice was steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. Arnor is not just a name in a forgotten book. It is a people, a legacy, and that legacy must be restored. Aelric studied him, measuring his words. "You would have us rebuild. Not with stone," Cadrin said. "With knowledge, with truth." Aelric was silent for a long time. Then, at last, he nodded. "You ask much, but you speak wisely." He gestured to the scroll, to the crown. "Let the Dunedain gather. Let them hear what you have found." Eldon exhaled softly, glancing at Cadrin with something almost like admiration. And so, that night, the hall was filled with voices. The Dunedain gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. They listened as Cadrin spoke of the veil, of the lost records, of the truth buried beneath centuries of dust and silence. The night stretched on, and when the final words were spoken, when the last whispers of history had been told, Cadrin knew the awakening of Arnor had begun. He did not know what the future would bring, But he knew this. The past would no longer be forgotten, and the name of Arnor would live once more. The dawn broke over the northern hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The air was crisp, filled with the distant call of birds and the rustling of leaves as the wind stirred through the valley. Cadrin stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the first rays of light touch the old stones of the Dunedain refuge. Behind him, the remnants of Arnor stirred. The night before had been long, filled with voices speaking in hushed yet fervent tones. The weight of history had settled upon the gathered Dunedain, each man and woman facing the truth of their heritage, the knowledge that they were the last bearers of a legacy stretching back to the great kings of old. Some had listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. Others had murmured among themselves, questions unspoken but clear in their eyes. What now? That was the question they all carried. Eldon stepped up beside him, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They believe you," he said at last. "Or at least, they want to." Cadrin let out a slow breath. Belief is the first step, but what comes next, that will take time. Eldon nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. Aelric will speak to the elders. Some will follow. Others will wait and watch. His voice dipped slightly. Not all are ready to leave the shadows. Cadrin turned to him, studying the set of his jaw. "Are you?" Eldon scoffed lightly. "I was never meant to hide, but to walk openly as a Dunedain that has not been done in centuries." His gaze dropped to the crown, which rested within its wrappings in Cadrin's satchel. "That is not just a symbol. It is a call to something greater." Cadrin nodded, "And it must be answered." The morning continued as the Dunedain stirred from their homes, gathering in quiet clusters near the great hall. Elders spoke in hushed tones, while younger men and women cast glances toward Cadrin and Eldon, curiosity and uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had lived their whole lives in secrecy, their existence shaped by caution and silence. To change that, to step into the world once more as the heirs of a fallen kingdom, was no small decision. Aelric emerged from the hall, his expression unreadable as he strode toward them. He glanced between the two men before speaking. "The council has spoken. Some are wary, but there are those who believe the time has come to reclaim our place in the world." Cadrin felt his heart quicken. "And you?" Aelric sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "I have spent my life leading a people who have known only exile. Change is not easy, but neither is extinction. If what you say is true, if the wisdom of the veil is as powerful as you claim, then perhaps it is time to remember who we once were." His sharp gaze settled on the satchel at Cadrin's side. "But the crown alone does not make a kingdom. What you propose is not a restoration of Arnor's past, but the building of its future." Cadrin met his gaze steadily. "Then let's begin." Aelric studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "The Dunedain will gather. Word will be sent to those still wandering the wilds, those who have kept to the shadows for too long. We will not raise banners or march to war, but we will remember. We will reclaim our name." Eldon exhaled, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That is more than we had yesterday." Aelric turned, signaling to the gathered men and women. "Then let us begin the telling of our past so that the future may know it." As the sun climbed higher, the people of the north gathered within the great hall. Scrolls were unrolled, records shared. Cadrin spoke of what he had learned in the Vale, the alliances with the northern elves, the forgotten wisdom of the kingdom, the strength of a people who had once stood beside Gondor as its equal. The old songs of Arnor were sung once more, voices carrying through the hall like an echo of the past rising from the dust. It was not a coronation. It was not a declaration of war, but it was a beginning. As the days passed, messengers were sent across the wilds, summoning the scattered Dunedain. From the farthest reaches of Eriador, they came. Lone rangers who had walked the empty roads for decades, guarding the ruins of a kingdom no longer standing. Families who had lived in secrecy, their children never knowing the true weight of their lineage. They arrived one by one, then in small groups, their numbers growing as whispers spread through the north. The lost were returning. The movement was slow, but undeniable. Campfires burned brighter. The old stories were told with more certainty. The weight of the past, once a burden, became a source of strength. One evening, Cadrin sat by the fire, running his fingers over the edges of the crown. It felt different now. Before, it had been an artifact, a relic of history. Now, it was something else. A promise. Eldon sat beside him, sharpening his blade. "You don't have to wear it, you know," he mused, glancing at the crown. Cadrin chuckled softly. "I never intended to." He met Eldon's gaze. "This isn't about a king. It's about a people." Eldon nodded. "Then what's next?" Cadrin looked toward the stars, his heart steady. The road ahead. The stars above shimmered like ancient eyes watching over them. And as the fire crackled softly in the night, Cadrin knew Arnor was no longer a forgotten name in the ruins of time. It was alive once more. The days passed like turning pages of an old tome, each one marking a step towards something that had not existed for centuries: hope. The Dunedain had begun to gather in greater numbers, summoned by whispers that carried through the northern wilds like the wind. They came from hidden valleys and deep forests, from mountain passes and riverlands where they had lived in exile for generations. Some arrived with caution in their eyes, uncertain of what awaited them. Others carried the quiet resolve of those who had always known they were waiting for this moment. The refuge that had once been a secret sanctuary was now stirring with life. The echoes of old songs wove through the air, mingling with the sounds of hammers striking wood as repairs were made to the ancient hall. The settlement, which had once seemed small and temporary, was growing, and yet Cadrin knew their journey had only begun. One evening, he and Eldon stood atop a ridge overlooking the valley, watching as fires flickered below, each one a beacon calling the lost home. The wind carried voices, laughter, the quiet murmur of reunions long delayed. Eldon exhaled, arms crossed over his chest. "It's strange," he murmured. "For years, we've wandered alone, each of us keeping to the shadows, believing there was nothing left for us. And now," he trailed off, as if afraid to give voice to the fragile thing that had begun to take root. Cadrin glanced at him. "And now we are remembering who we are." Eldon nodded slowly. "But is remembering enough?" Cadrin followed his gaze, watching the flickering lights of the settlement. "No," he admitted. "It's only the beginning. The past could not be restored in full. The old cities would not rise from ruin, and the world had changed in ways that could never be undone. But the Dunedain were not just relics of a lost kingdom. They were its living heart, and as long as they carried its name, Arnor was not truly gone. Aelric had begun to call councils, gathering the elders of the Dunedain to discuss what lay ahead. Though they had no king, the people looked to him for guidance, and his wisdom had steadied them in their years of wandering. But even he knew that leadership alone would not be enough. What we build must endure, he had told Cadrin one morning as they walked the edges of the settlement. Not just for our children, but for those who come after. We must be more than memories. We must have purpose. And so the Dunedain set to work. Scouts rode out to the ruins of old strongholds, marking what could still be used. Hunters patrolled the borders, watching for signs of danger. Families settled into the valley, repairing homes that had once been abandoned to time. Eldon, ever restless, took to training the younger men and women, ensuring that they could defend what they had begun to build. The art of the sword and bow, once practiced in solitude, was now passed down openly, no longer hidden in secrecy. Cadrin spent his days in the Great Hall, unrolling maps and records, deciphering the writings he had carried from the Forgotten Vale. He pieced together histories, tracing the alliances that had once tied Arnor to the elves of the north, the trade routes that had connected them to Gondor, the ancient laws that had governed their people. But as the days stretched into weeks, one question loomed over them all. What came next? They could not remain hidden forever. The world beyond their valley continued on, and sooner or later, the time would come to step beyond their borders. The return of Arnor was not a matter of reclaiming land. It was a matter of rejoining the world. One evening, as the first touches of autumn cooled the air, a rider arrived at the settlement's edge. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his expression was grim. Eldon met him first, gripping his forearm in greeting. "What is it?" The rider swallowed, shaking his head. "Gondor," he said, breathless. "The king has called for word of the north." Cadrin's blood turned to ice. Gondor knew. Eldon turned to him, unreadable. "We were always going to have to face this," he murmured. Cadrin exhaled, steadying himself. "Then we decide how." The council was called that very night. The elders of the Dunedain gathered in the hall, their faces lined with age and wisdom. The rider, a scout from the southern roads, stood before them, relaying what he had learned. A message had come from Gondor, carried by merchants and travelers who passed through the wild lands. King Elessar, the rightful heir of Isildur, had begun to ask about the north, about the Dunedain. "What does he want?" One of the elders asked, his voice wary. "To know if we are still here," the scout answered. A silence fell over the room. Aelric leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This is not unexpected." His gaze swept across the gathered faces. "We have long known that our time in the shadows would not last forever." A woman near the hearth, her dark hair streaked with silver, shook her head. "But what will he ask of us?" Cadrin hesitated before speaking. "Perhaps not what we fear," he said carefully. "King Elessar is one of us. He was raised in these lands, among our people. If there is anyone who who would understand our struggle. It is him. Aelric studied him for a long moment. Then we send an envoy. Murmurs rippled through the room. To what end? One man asked. Aelric's gaze was unwavering. To tell our story, to speak for those who have been silent for too long. Cadrin felt the weight of the moment settle upon his shoulders. The journey was far from over. But this was the next step. Eldon met his gaze, his smirk faint but knowing. Looks like you'll be needing a travel companion. Cadrin huffed a quiet laugh. I wouldn't have it any other way. And so, as the fires burned low and the stars gleamed overhead, the path ahead was set. They would go to Gondor. They would stand before the king. And for the first time in centuries, the heirs of Arnor would no longer be exiles. They would be heard. The road stretched before them, winding through the wild lands of the north toward the White City beyond the mountains. And though uncertainty lay ahead, one thing was certain. Arnor had risen, not in stone, not in banners, but in its people, and the world would know its name once more. The morning was crisp as Cadrin and Eldon prepared their journey southward. The weight of what lay ahead settled upon them like the cool mist that curled through the valley, a silent reminder that the world beyond their sanctuary awaited. Word had spread swiftly. Arnor was stirring, and the past was no longer content to remain buried. The Dunedain gathered at the edge of the settlement to see them off. Some watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Others clasped their arms, offering quiet words of luck and wisdom. Aelric stood among them, his sharp gaze fixed upon Cadrin. You carry more than history on this journey, the chieftain said. You carry the voice of our people. Cadrin inclined his head. And I will not let it be lost. Eldon, adjusting the strap of his satchel, smirked slightly. Let's just hope Gondor's court is as eager to listen as we are to speak. Aelric chuckled, though there was a weight in his eyes. A kingdom is not measured by its thrones, but by those who stand behind them. He turned serious once more. King Elessar was once one of us, but the years in Gondor may have changed him. He is not just our kin now, he is a ruler. Tread carefully. Cadrin nodded. We will. With that, they mounted their horses. As the morning sun crested over the hills, they rode south, leaving behind the valley that had sheltered the last of Arnor's heirs. But it was no longer a place of hiding. It was a place of rebirth. The journey was long, taking them through lands untouched by time. They passed through dense forests, where golden leaves whispered in the wind, over rivers that cut deep into the earth like veins of silver. The wilds of Eriador stretched before them, vast and quiet, but no longer empty. They stopped at ancient waystones, remnants of a road that had once connected the great cities of the north. The stones were worn by wind and rain, their inscriptions barely legible, but they still stood. A reminder that though Arnor had fallen, it had never truly died. As they made camp beneath the stars, Eldon watched the firelight flicker across Cadrin's face. Do you think he'll welcome us? Cadrin glanced up from the old map he had been studying. Elessar. Eldon nodded. Cadrin hesitated before answering. I think he will listen. He traced a finger over the faded lines of the parchment. But what he does after that is yet to be seen. Eldon leaned back against his saddle, exhaling slowly. If nothing else, it will be a story worth telling. They rode on, the road shifting beneath them as the land changed. Hills gave way to rolling plains. Forests turned to open fields. They passed through villages where the banners of Gondor fluttered in the autumn breeze, where farmers and merchants cast curious glances their way. To many, they were just travelers, cloaked figures on horseback. But to those who knew the old songs, to those who still whispered of a kingdom lost to time, they were something more. By the time they reached the borders of Gondor, the white city loomed in the distance, its towers rising like pale fire against the sky. Minas Tirith. It had stood for thousands of years, weathering war and darkness, a beacon of strength in the south. And now, within its walls, sat the last heir of Isildur, the man who had reclaimed Gondor's throne and reunited the realms of men. The king of Gondor awaited. As they approached the great gates, the guards stepped forward, their hands resting on their weapons. "State your names and your purpose," one of them called. Eldon glanced at Cadrin. "Well, here we go." Cadrin straightened in his saddle. "We come as envoys of the north," he said, his voice steady. "We bear word of the Dunedain and of Arnor." The guard's brow furrowed. There was a pause, then a whispered exchange between him and his companion. Then, with a nod, they stepped aside. "You will be taken to the king." Cadrin exhaled, gripping the reins tighter. This was the moment. They rode through the city streets, where people bustled about, pausing briefly to glance at the cloaked figures passing through. Whispers followed them, words half heard, fragments of recognition, the quiet hum of something stirring in the hearts of those who still remembered the old tales. By the time they reached the citadel, night had begun to settle over Minas Tirith, casting long shadows against the white stone walls. They dismounted, their boots echoing against the polished floors as they were led through the great halls. Then, at last, the doors to the throne room opened, and there, seated upon the high throne of Gondor, was the king, Elessar Aragorn, the last of Isildur's line, the man who had once walked the wilds as a ranger of the north, now robed in royal garments, his sword resting at his side. His presence was commanding, but there was something in his gaze, something that spoke of the man who had once lived in exile, who had once carried the same burdens they did. He studied them in silence for a long moment. Then, his voice, deep and measured, filled the hall. "Who comes before me?" Cadrin stepped forward, bowing his head. Cadrin of the north, of the scholar's line, and Eldon, ranger of the Dunedain. Elessar's gaze flickered at the name. Recognition, a trace of memory stirring beneath his regal bearing. "And what have you brought from the north?" Cadrin reached into his satchel. Slowly, reverently, he withdrew the crown of Arnor. A hush fell over the room. The silver gleamed under the torchlight, its sapphires glinting like the stars of Elendil. Elessar's breath stilled. The hall was silent. Then, at last, the king of Gondor rose from his throne. He descended the steps slowly, his gaze fixed on the crown, on the piece of history he had thought lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but filled with something deeper. "The North remembers," he murmured. Cadrin held the crown out, "and it is ready to rise." Alessar took it, turning it in his hands, as if weighing not just the metal, but the legacy it carried. Then he looked at them, and he smiled. The night stretched on as they spoke in the halls of Minas Tirith. Of history, of legacy, of the future. And as the stars wheeled above, the fate of Arnor, once lost to time, began to take shape once more. The halls of Minas Tirith echoed with voices deep into the night. Maps were unrolled, histories revisited, and the future of the North debated beneath the flickering glow of candlelight. Cadrin and Eldon stood before King Alessar, the weight of their journey pressing upon them, the crown of Arnor resting between them like a silent witness to all that had been lost and all that could be restored. Alessar traced a finger along the rim of the crown, his expression unreadable. "You have brought me more than a relic," he murmured. "You have brought me a choice." Cadrin nodded. "We did not come to ask for a throne, nor for banners to be raised in war. Arnor is not just a name, it is a people, and they are ready to step out of the shadows." Alessar's keen gaze met his. "And what would you have me do?" Eldon, who had been silent for much of the discussion, finally spoke. "Acknowledge us. Let the world know that Arnor still lives, not in ruins, but in its bloodline. We do not seek to rebuild what was lost. We seek to reclaim our place." A heavy silence settled over the chamber. The fire crackled, the banners above them shifting slightly in the night breeze that filtered through the high windows. Then at last, Alessar nodded. "The North shall be remembered," he said, his voice firm. "Not as a fallen kingdom, but as a living one." He lifted the crown, its silver gleaming in the dim light. "This symbol, once thought lost, shall no longer be a relic hidden in the past. The Dunedain will have their place in the world again, not as exiles, but as the rightful heirs of their own legacy." Cadrin felt his breath catch. This was more than he had hoped for. Alessar's gaze softened slightly as he studied them. "You have done what many before you could not. You have brought the past into the present, but your journey is not yet over." He exhaled. "Return to the North. Tell your people that they no longer stand alone." Eldon smirked. "Does that mean we have Gondor's favor?" Alessar chuckled. "You have more than that. You have its recognition." The meeting stretched long into the early hours. Discussions of alliances, trade, and the return of northern roads, all weaving into the fabric of what would come next. By the time Cadrin and Eldon stepped out into the cool dawn air, the first rays of sunlight were spilling over the white city, gilding its towers in gold. Eldon stretched, letting out a long breath. "Well, that went better than expected." Cadrin chuckled. "I think we just rewrote history. The journey home was different. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear that they were chasing ghosts. Now, they carried something real, not just a crown, but a promise." Days later, when they rode back into the valley of the Dunedain, the people gathered at the sight of them. Elders, rangers, and families stepped forward, their expressions filled with silent questions. Aelric stood at the forefront, his sharp gaze sweeping over them. "Well," Cadrin dismounted, stepping forward with steady resolve. "Gondor has not forgotten us. The world will know our name again." Aelric studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then the time has come." The settlement stirred with new energy. messages were sent, scouts rode out, and preparations began not for war, but for a future. The Dunedain would no longer be mere shadows guarding the past. They would be the architects of what was to come. That night, as the fires burned bright and the stars shimmered overhead, Cadrin sat beside Eldon, staring out at the land that had once been called Arnor. "We did it," Eldon murmured. Cadrin smiled. "No, we only began it." The night wind carried the whispers of the past. But now, they were not mere echoes. They were the voices of a people, ready to rise again. And so, beneath the vast northern sky, with the crown of Arnor resting safely once more in the hands of its rightful heirs, a forgotten kingdom awoke, not in stone, nor in war, but in the hearts of those who had never truly let it die. The North would rise, and this time it would endure. The end